everyone. You'll be able to hear me? Yeah. So I'd like to begin with the proposition that we need systemic record keeping, interdepartmental, intergovernmental, cross-sector collaboration for reliable data to understand the nature, the prevalence, and the magnitude of inequalities, and to understand their interrelationship in terms of what forms a causative factor, a predictive factor, or an environmental or societal condition that then contributes to creating a systemic cycle of deprivation and inequality among particular groups in Hong Kong. Data, therefore, is the key to unlocking our understanding to help us quantify and qualify the social justice problems that we face today, but also to inform our policies and design programs that are based on evidence. More broadly, it helps us to visualize aspects that we may not be able to see without such data. We can recognize very specifically the impact of a particular law or set of laws and policies and systems on the lives of people who are subjected to the systems, but also how there is variation intergroup, but also within groups. So in this sense, disaggregated data, so not just data as a broad metric, but disaggregated data enables us to identify specific sites of disadvantage and marginality, helping us to ask the right questions to address the social problems that we're interested in. For example, how is age or gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or a combination of these factors impacting the quality of life, the ability to access particular spaces, services, or capacities for performing to our maximum potential in society if our laws and policies are grounded in this commitment to equality of access and non-discrimination on all of the grounds that we've just stated. So disaggregated data enables us to see what we ordinarily would not be able to see, and to see it in a very different light. So we have certain assumptions and impressions, but data helps clarify and make those assumptions much more reliable and astute. And that then leads us to recognize the justice gap, right? To make visible what has been invisible, but also to unveil or unravel some of the hidden structural aspects that impact people's access to public services or opportunity. And then that enables us to design and apply our limited resources in a very targeted way to develop specific policies that seek to close that particular gap. So we might have broad brush principles relating to equality and non-discrimination, but with disaggregated data, we can go back and monitor our progress and the effectiveness of the solutions that we've designed, and to test whether the measures are having the desired impact on particular groups. And with that, we can continue to refine our approaches, our design, and hopefully make efficient use of our limited resources. Of course, the significance of open data isn't just that it's telling us something. What we have in front of us beckons us to ask, what does this data tell us? But what does the data not tell us? And what is the absence of data telling us? The importance, as I said earlier, of disaggregated data is that it enables something that is called an intersectional analysis and many of you who are scientists in the room, I'm not, but I understand you do multivariate analysis. And that's basically where you pool together different variables to understand what is the strength of impact of any given variable or set of variables on the outcomes that you're looking at. What explains what we see? And there is an underlying challenge, though, around the ethical uses of data, and John's alluded to some of those. But in the context of minority issues, and I work on minority rights mainly, and particularly the rights of ethnic minorities, there is an ethical concern underlying the use of data and how it's presented, because it can have the potential to create a negative impact or stigma in terms of the groups that are represented or seen to be represented in particular ways. And that's why it's very important not only to talk about open data, but also ethical collection of data and ethical representation of particular types of data and contextualizing that data properly. So we have a responsibility not just to put material out there, but also share how that material needs to be understood. And I'll share an example of how open data that was made available through what we have in Hong Kong enabled me to put some of the data out there into context, but also to learn many things that we perhaps didn't think about or know specifically with respect to Hong Kong's ethnic minorities. So broadly, I work, as I said, in the area of minority rights, and there's a range of issues that I deal with in my work, including gender-based violence, children, migrant workers, sexual minorities, human trafficking in ethnic minorities, but also within these groupings, I'm looking at gender, ethnicity, race, religion, and age, and how all of that then changes the metric of what you're looking for and what you're looking at, and what these groups need in order to have their situations adequately addressed from an equality and justice perspective. So, an example, as I said, is looking at the work that is currently being done on ethnic minorities in Hong Kong. Many of you would be aware that there is currently a great deal of momentum around the issues and trying to recognize and understand some of the challenges faced by this particular community in Hong Kong. And it's been really helpful to have access to a wide range of open data sources to enable me to do this work. Although it provides primarily broad brush data, which isn't extremely detailed, but is adequately detailed to enable, and increasingly it's been able to allow us to do intersectional work of the nature that I alluded to just now. So it enables a detailed analysis by the different variables that may tell us a story about why certain groups are performing at a particular level in respect of certain areas of life, whether it's education or employment or poverty, and how do these sort of experiences in these different areas of life affect each other, and how do they impact future life prospects for equality or quality of life, but also how they impact then on the next generation and the next generation. So the government has increasingly provided more detailed reports, particularly since 2001, in the form of its thematic reports on ethnic minorities, and more recently on the Hong Kong Poverty Situation Report on South Asians and Hong Kong. And so the work that I've primarily done is bringing together all relevant data from the open sources I just mentioned, but also all available academic research on Hong Kong's ethnic minorities that is sort of free to use, to disaggregate it and analyze it, and to sort of map it against the life trajectory of different ethnic groups in Hong Kong, and to examine the differences between various ethnic groups as well. And so you can start to see a very specific story about Hong Kong's ethnic minorities. In some ways, the story here about racial minorities matches or maps quite clearly onto the global trends that we see in terms of minority population groups, whether you're talking about the UK or the US or Australia or Canada. But then there are, of course, specific differences with respect to how these patterns manifest in Hong Kong and which groups are the worst off in this particular in this particular context, which forces us to ask, well, where do those differences stem from, and why are those groups targeted or singled out through the system, not necessarily deliberately, but there's a combination of factors that is unveiled as we were able to do this particular analysis. So I just want to say at the outset as well, so the Status of Ethnic Minorities report tried to gather sort of the analysis looking at sort of the post-1997 situation, because there were a range of changes in policy, so I wanted to capture that. But what it's done is by putting everything in one space and providing a mapping across sort of these different areas of life and stages, it's enabled policymakers, legislators, teachers, government officials as well, NGO colleagues to draw on this and to use it as a conversation starter. Because Hong Kong has had a historical problem in addressing its own race discrimination challenge. We started out in the 80s and early 90s with a great deal of denial around whether there even was a problem relating to race in Hong Kong. And a lot of that stemmed perhaps from the fact that we were a colony, and a lot of the policies that were in place weren't things that were created by the Hong Kong government that we have today. But the report enables us to speak to and to confront these issues, because now there is data and there are statistics which basically call for an explanation. So if it's not race, then why is it that the system seems to be ineffective in enhancing access and opportunities for particular groups? So what have we been able to do with this data, and how has it helped us better understand the challenges, and how has it impacted policies? So for example, disaggregated data enabled us to see through intersectional analysis that ethnic minority populations tend to be younger compared with the general population in Hong Kong on average. And that may lead to a policy recommendation that we ought to invest more extensively in ethnic minority youth today, because they're going to be the responding sort of the responding age groups when our elderly population comes of age, or they're going to be the ones who are going to be participating more actively, or should be participating more actively in the workforce. So we have that, and we can also see from this that this group is more productive in terms of births. There's also interesting things happening if you disaggregate the data by gender, age, and ethnicity and put it all together to see what the intersectional analysis tells you there. We see that there are wide sex ratio disparities in some groups in particular. And if you focus on, for example, the Pakistani community, you can see that the yellow line represents all those aged 65 and above. So the male to female ratio is 1 to 14,000 in that age category. And then, of course, you can look at the other bar, which is also quite significant, the Japanese, and then the Caucasian population, and the other mixed category. So you start to see that there are different things happening in different groups. And at first blush, you might write off the Pakistani figure as something to do with culture or religion, but then you realize, well, there are other groups that are behaving in a similar way. And you might ask, is that to do with labor importation schemes? How come there are these missing women in terms of sort of that age group? And what does that tell us about the mental or physical health issues and challenges that our senior males in Hong Kong will face, right, with in terms of their family unit and their lifestyle? We also learned, for example, that Hong Kong's education system doesn't seem to work to enhance equality of educational opportunities for ethnic minorities. Disaggregated by age and by ethnicity, we see ethnic minority children are starting school later, they're dropping out of school earlier, and they're less likely to enter into post-secondary education. There are a lot of barriers that have been identified, but the studies, again, pulled together, help us put this data into context. Particular groups are more likely to fall into these patterns. They're the Filipina, the Nepalese, and the Pakistani community. So the question is, well, why them? And the answer to that comes when you look at the poverty figures. But just before I jump to poverty, we see that with this, if you further disaggregate by special education needs or disability, we now know that among ethnic minority children, 57% of special education needs drop out of primary school, never make it to secondary, compared with 5% of the general population of children who are special education needs kids. So that's a huge dropout rate. And what that told us is that there's a gap in the public sector schools which are not providing education in English to non-Chinese speaking children with special education needs. And that formed the basis of a policy recommendation for the Education Bureau to look at so that they can target their resources accordingly. These are the figures relating to who receive post-secondary education by ethnicity. And again, you could see a lot of variation across the groups, and you can almost sort of put it in a hierarchy, and you can compare it with the general population of Hong Kong. And broadly speaking, we learned through this mapping that Chinese as a language remains the primary barrier, and that explains a lot of the lack of access in many of these spaces. Lack of Chinese proficiency on the part of the children, obviously, but particularly the family context, the lack of opportunity for exposure and practice as well, tends to impact admission rates and the through train effect all the way through to university. Labor force participation, if you break that down by gender, age, and ethnicity, you can again see who's most active and who's least active. The green line, you can see Pakistani women tend to be least active in the labor force in this particular year. So I think this was with respect to 2011. And the general population is the red line above, and everybody else is below. But you can see different things are happening with particular ethnic groups here. There's a child poverty problem among ethnic minority communities, but also in particular, so 1 in 3 children are likely to be living below the poverty line among ethnic minority children. And for particular 2 specific groups, the Nepalese and the Pakistanis, 1 in 2 are potentially living below poverty. And of course, with different interventions, there are changes now occurring with these figures, but there is an intergenerational effect. And if you go back to the education data, you can start to see that those are the children who are most likely to drop out of school early. And the reason they're dropping out is not because, as some of the narrative used to be, I'm glad to say it's not so much so anymore, but the narrative used to be ethnic minority children are not very bright, they're quite lazy, or their parents are not committed to their education, they don't believe in education as the future. That narrative has now changed because now we know why. Perhaps the parents need the extra hands to work so that they can earn an income, because those families tend to be larger, but also they're already living in poverty. And then there are a lot of other challenges that may preclude them from participating in the typical trajectory of a Hong Kong youth to get through the education system. So household sizes are important. And the bigger household sizes, for example, have a disproportionately lower income, and that comes down to what are the occupations that ethnic minorities find themselves in. So again, if you look at that data by gender and by ethnicity, you can see that the majority of particular ethnic minority groups are in manual or unskilled labor occupations compared with the general population. And specific education, ethnic minority groups tend to do better or are in sort of higher end professional groups. And that is also explained by their participation in different stages of education. So this disaggregated data then and the intersectional sort of framework I was able to develop around it enabled sort of a very distinct and specific view of the disparate impact of education policy, but also media instruction policies on ethnic minorities and the critical lack of equality in different domains. The book itself has chapters on health, employment, poverty, education, discrimination, experience of discrimination, law enforcement. And so that sort of forces people who are working in these areas, but also on the front line, to challenge the traditional frames of understanding the problem that we think we have. So we might think, Hong Kong's ethnic minority problem is the result of most of them being immigrants coming here and then they can't integrate. But that's not the problem. These are also part of families who have been here for some time and they continue to experience these problems. And so it's a much more complex picture, and this type of analysis enables us to see that. And that also challenges the status quo that, just because we have guarantees of equality in the law, that therefore everything should, in good time, be corrected. But I think that this analysis reveals that corrective justice can only happen if you undertake very specific changes. And I'm glad that this report has then led to a series of conversations with relevant people across the community, including government bureau officials, but all the way right through to Mrs. Carrie Lam when she was Chief Secretary, to whom we presented these findings and recommendations. And we can see the effects of some of that coming out now as a result of various steps that have been taken in response to this research. So for example, we now have a high-level body such as the Steering Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs, which now looks from a macro level, looks at the policies and issues affecting ethnic minorities. And then there are also micro-level committees. So we know that the Poverty Commission, for example, was set up, and one of the groups that it was looking at was special needs groups, including ethnic minorities as well. LegCo subcommittees have examined a range of these issues that have come up since the 2015 report. And then the framework is increasingly being utilized with NGO practitioners challenging the government to address or provide resources to target specific groups that fall, across multiple areas of vulnerability or marginality, such as children or ethnic minority women. It's also helped raise the public awareness around these issues and prompted a review and reassessment of our laws. And most importantly, I think for this particular audience, it's also opened up many other spaces for asking questions about what else we could do with data like this and what other areas of research need to be done to help us enhance further our understanding of many of these challenges. So we can't fix a problem if we can't see the problem and if we can't see it accurately. And increasingly open and disaggregated data carries this potential to help us develop innovative and interdisciplinary solutions to social justice problems that unfortunately continue to plague the world more broadly, but are still part not only of our history, but also of our present. So I hope that would encourage us to do more along these lines. And I welcome the steps that the government and others are taking, and I hope that we can work collaboratively to do more of this sort of work. Thank you.